What does the King of Horror have to say about Buddhism? Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me again today. Today, I am very excited to start my new series that I am calling The Buddhist Path in Fiction. And this series is born from my lifelong love for Stephen King, combined with my fundamental thesis that when I engage in reading or participating in any type of art, but in this case, reading, it's possible to do so in such a way that doesn't sacrifice pleasure, joy, or fun, that doesn't sacrifice the ability to use reading as a way to forget about your daily troubles for a while. But on top of that, to use reading as part of my spiritual path, as part of my spiritual practice. And since I am a religiously oriented person, that's the language I use. But for others who aren't so religiously oriented, what I mean by that is how can we use reading in such a way that it teaches us something about ourselves, teaches us something about the world around us, and teaches us something about how we engage with the world around us, or maybe how we want to engage with the world around us, right? How to make our life more meaningful. And I believe that when you do a type of deep reading or intimate reading, you can get something from even the schlockiest of pulp horror that will lead you toward that spiritual goal of making your life more meaningful, of making yourself a better person. And so that is always my goal when I read. I've talked about that quite a lot on my channel. And so combining that with my love for Stephen King, this Stephen King edition of The Buddhist Path in Fiction, I wanted to create essentially a virtual book club where we can talk about these ideas together. I'll say right here at the top that I'm not going to discuss any books today. Today is just an introduction to the series, as well as an introduction to the kind of philosophical ideas that I'm hoping to explore and play with as we continue the series together. And then at the end, I will mention what book I'm going to start off the series with, so people have a chance to read it before the next video in the series comes out. So when I was thinking about how to structure this, if I was teaching this as a course, as a class, I would start with the philosophy and then go to the fiction. So I have a set of philosophical ideas that I want to cover, and there is a sequence to them as well that is taught in my tradition, and I'll explain that momentarily. But I would try to find a book that covers each of those different philosophical ideas or is a good example of it. And that way I could teach them in order because there's a reason they're taught in that order. That would be the goal. Yet the truth is, I haven't read some of these books in 2 decades, even 3 decades for some of them. And so I remember all of Stephen King's books, and I could tell you the basic outline of the plot, and I could tell you my experience reading it. But my memory of it has probably transformed from what the book is. And I want to make sure I'm choosing books that are actually, I don't have to twist them to meet my kind of project. So I don't have the time to read 12 books ahead of time and to plan that out. Instead, what I could do is the other direction. Instead of going from philosophy to fiction, go from fiction to philosophy. And this is more in line with how we read in general and how normal book clubs go. So just choose the book, and then from that book, see what we get out of it. See what ideas are brought up in that book. And if I was doing a book club at a Buddhist center, this is what I would do. But the difference is, in that context, all of the students would have a baseline understanding, right? So we'd have a shared language, and that's not the case here. So that is a little open-ended, and it may not be quite as fulfilling. So instead, I think I'm going to go for a hybrid approach, which is I'm going to try to choose books that will line up with certain philosophical ideas in the sequence that I think is useful. And if I'm right, then great. And in those videos, I'll do a little bit deeper explanation of the philosophical ideas that I'm exploring, as well as how the book touches on those and other ideas as well. If I'm wrong and the book doesn't emphasize those ideas in a meaningful way, then we'll see what else the book has to offer, because there's always going to be something. So that way, I can try to have structure, but I'm not going to have to plan, 12 videos ahead of time or however many it be. So that's what the plan is going to be, I have an overall structure I'd like to follow, and we'll see what comes, if I'm able to stick to that or not. Now, where does this structure come from? This is a brief introduction to some of the philosophical ideas that I'm going to be exploring and the reason I'm going to structure them the way I am. The historical Buddha taught whoever was in front of him. Right? He didn't teach anything in order. He taught to the needs of the audience. So whatever the student needed in order to advance in their spiritual practice, in order to come closer to being free from suffering, that is what he taught. So you can't look at the Buddhist teachings as being an ordered sequence. And when the Buddhist teachings were all collected and contained in volumes, they weren't contained or collected thematically. The early teachings were collected by how long they were. So all of the short teachings were put together and so forth. So if you pick up like the volume 1 of the Buddhist collected teachings and go all the way to the end, there's not a single trajectory, a coherent trajectory. It's little bits and pieces mixed together. So numerous Buddhist scholars throughout time have taken all of the major topics and put them in a sequence that said, this is the most beneficial way to engage with this material if you want to study, if you want to meditate, if you want to practice. This is how you start where you are right now, which is in samsara. So samsara is the term we use to recognize this endless cycle of death and rebirth that is against our wishes, that is, by the power of karma and by the power of our delusions. That's where you are, this cycle of suffering that is samsara. And where you want to be is Buddhahood. So these are the steps that you need to take to get there. So numerous teachers have created outlines like this. The one we follow was pioneered by Atisha Dipankara. He was actually a Bengali scholar. He was born in the 10th century, and he was a master at Vikramashila Monastery, which is at the time one of the two main monasteries or monastic universities in India. There was Vikramashila Monastery and Nalanda Monastery. And a Tibetan king requested him to come to Tibet to teach. Now, Buddhism had come to Tibet in the 8th century, but by the end of the 10th century, it had degenerated a little bit. There was a lot of infighting and there was a lot of partisanship. So they requested Atisha to come, and he eventually did, and he served as a reformer. He's responsible for reforming Tibetan Buddhism as we know it. And when he went to Tibet, he composed this text that is called The Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. And in that, he proposed this sequence of how to study these philosophical topics in a specific order. And what he did that was uncommon was he didn't only create a sequence, but he identified 3 different capacities of being. So there's this being of small capacity, middling capacity, and small and great capacity. Or we sometimes say the small scope, medium scope, and the great scope. And those scopes have different meditative practices and different objects of philosophical study included within each of them. And they are all part of the Buddhist path, but they have different aims. They have different ends. So the way we explain this usually is, if there are 4 people who are all reciting prayers together, so outwardly they're doing the exact same activity, but the first person has the motivation or the intention that they're reciting these prayers for the purpose of receiving rewards in this life, whether that be comfort, pleasure, fame, prosperity, any sort of worldly rewards in this very life. If that is their motivation, then we say they're not actually engaging in Buddhist practice at all. What they're doing is a worldly practice. It is not a spiritual practice. It is not a Buddhist practice, even though it's Buddhist prayers that they're reciting, if their aims are for this life. So then the second person is reciting the prayers, and their motivation is to have a positive rebirth, to be reborn again as a human or as a god or demigod, to be reborn in such a way that they continue to practice the Dharma. So they're praying for a positive rebirth. So that is the motivation that is in line with the being of the small scope. Now, the next person has the motivation that says, being reborn with a positive rebirth is not enough, because having a nice view from your prison cell means you're still in prison, and I want to be free from this prison of samsara. So therefore, they are looking with the motivation to be free from suffering entirely, to achieve some sort of liberation for themselves. We might call it nirvana or liberation. So freedom from suffering for themselves. That is the medium scope. And the great scope recognizes with the motivation that being free from suffering for myself is not enough, because even if I am free, there are countless other sentient beings who are suffering. So my motivation is not to free myself from suffering, but to free every other sentient being from suffering. That is my goal, is that I want every being to be free from samsara, to not have any suffering at all. And so everything I do is with that as my first and pure motivation. And so as Mahayana Buddhists, as Tibetan Buddhists, we always try to adopt that third attitude, that everything we do should be done for the benefit of others. And yet we recognize that all of these 3 scopes, the small scope, the medium scope, and the great scope, are authentic teachings of the Buddha, and they're necessary Buddhist practices and meditative practices and philosophical ideas that we need to have experience with if we hope to become a Buddha, if we hope to progress to the perfect state of Buddhahood. So we always have a Mahayana motivation, a great scope motivation, but we need to do all of these practices in this order. So that was by sequencing them that way and identifying the 3 types of being, or the 3 scopes, that was Atisha's uncommon addition to this genre. So We call this the Lamrim genre. Lamrim means stages of the path. So if you ever hear anything discussed as a stages of the path text or a Lamrim text, it's going to be using these as the main outline, right? And it's going to have a set number of meditative ideas that they're going to go through in more or less this sequence. The most famous Lamrim text is called the Lamrim Chemo, or the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment, which was composed by Jetson Kappa, Lobsang Drakpa. He was a 14th, 15th century scholar who's the founder of my lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the Gaelic lineage. And just to show kind of how loquacious commentators are, Atisha's original text was 68 verses long, and Tsongkhapa's text, when translated into English, is about 1,200 pages long. So obviously, there's a lot more in these topics. These are just kind of the root ideas, and all of the other Buddhist philosophical ideas, they can be extrapolated from these ideas. So what are those ideas, since this is how I'm going to be structuring or trying to structure my class? So first, we have the small scope practices, or as we would say, we have the practices and meditations and philosophical ideas that are shared in common with the small scope. And the very first one of those is perfect human rebirth. This is a type of meditation that is reflecting on basically the privileges we have, where we have the opportunity to practice a spiritual life. So that is the first topic. And then from there, we meditate on death and impermanence. So by meditating on impermanence, we recognize we have a more realistic experience of reality. And by meditating on death, it motivates us to practice. So now that we first develop the awareness of our privilege and our capacity for practice, and that is inspiring, then we are motivated to practice by meditating on death. Next, we meditate generally on the suffering of the lower realms. So the suffering of animals, as well as other lower realm rebirths we call hungry ghosts or hell beings. And we meditate on those because we need to be propelled, again, with the small scope practice, and the very minimum to have a positive rebirth so we can continue our study and our practice. So we meditate on that suffering, and by doing that, we recognize how it amplifies the need for us to practice more urgently. And then after meditating on that, the next topic that's covered is usually meditating on refuge. So refuge in the three jewels. So the three jewels are the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Sangha jewel. So the Dharma are the teachings that the Buddha gave, and the Sangha are the realized practitioners. And we recognize those three as the only authentic sources of refuge, the only things that will keep us safe within samsara and will lead us out of samsara. So there's meditations on what it means to go for proper refuge and how do you define proper refuge. Then after refuge, we meditate on karma, so the law of cause and effect, how our actions in this life will affect our experiences in the future, and how our experiences right now have been shaped by our actions in the past. So we have to understand karma, and with that, different types of virtuous and non-virtuous behavior, so we can then project a future that we want by engaging in the appropriate behavior now, by understanding cause and effect. And then after cause and effect, we generally meditate on the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths are the bedrock philosophical idea that the Buddha taught in his very first sermon and is shared across every Buddhist lineage. So the Four Noble Truths are very simply that suffering exists in the world, that there is a cause to suffering, there is a cessation to suffering, and there is a path that leads to the cessation of suffering. And so by understanding this kind of principle philosophical idea, that helps us negotiate our place in samsara and find our way out of it. And so at this point, we're transitioning into the middle scope being. And in addition to the Four Noble Truths, that we then meditate more directly on suffering, and we look at different types of suffering in the human realm, and then the suffering of samsara in general. And through that, we develop a mind of renunciation. So we meditate on what it means to renounce samsara. And then after renunciation, we tend to meditate on what are called the 12 links of interdependent origination. And now interdependence is kind of a very well-used term in like pop culture these days. And what people mean by it and what we mean by it when we say interdependent origination isn't always the same thing. Here, the 12 links are showing how one action can create a karma that then has a karmic result of a future rebirth. And so you see that whole cycle of cause and effect in action, starting with one mental action, and from that one mental action, moving through all these 12 steps to be the natural progression or fruition of that karmic action, which is generally a rebirth. So that's what we mean by interdependence, or the 12 links of interdependence. But there are other meanings to the term interdependence, and those are all discussed and explored as part of this medium scope practice. And then you finally move on to the great scope practices. So these are the uncommon practices. And these start with generating a mind of bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is a mind that wishes to become a Buddha, not for one's own benefit, but for the benefit of all sentient beings, right? And that in itself is infused with ideas of compassion and love and joy and equanimity. And what does it mean to dedicate yourself wholly to others? And so that is the entryway into becoming a bodhisattva, is to develop bodhicitta. So that's what's meditated on first, is bodhicitta and how to develop bodhicitta. From there, we tend to look at the actions of bodhisattvas. So bodhisattvas are beings who have realized an unfabricated type of bodhicitta in their mental continuum. And so we often say that there are 6 perfected activities of bodhisattvas that we ordinary beings need to strive to perfect in our lives as well. And so these are called the 6 perfections, or the 6 paramitas. And these are generosity, morality, patience, vigilance, concentration, and wisdom. And generally, when you're talking about the perfection of concentration, then there's more discussion of higher levels of meditative realization. And when you're talking about the perfection of wisdom, that's when you're talking about emptiness. So emptiness is the ultimate philosophical view that the Buddha taught, and it is the nature of reality. So when you can understand emptiness, then you understand the nature of reality. And this is important because if we want to be free from suffering, we want to become Buddhas, we want to become perfected beings, then we need to eliminate all of our obscurations, our afflictive obscurations, as well as our cognitive obscurations. And to do that, we have to have direct, unmediated recognition and realization of emptiness, of the nature of reality. And that serves as the antidote for all of our afflictions, both coarse and subtle. And in order to strengthen that, that needs to be combined with the merit we accumulate by engaging in the actions of a bodhisattva, so the paramitas, by developing bodhicitta. So we see how bodhicitta and wisdom work together, and they're both critical in order to become Buddhas. So those are the 2 final topics. So that is an overview of the Buddhist philosophical topics that are contained in the Lamrim. And we say all the Buddhist teachings fall into those and to some subcategory of those. Now, later teachers such as Tsongkhapa have added how to properly rely on a guru or to rely on a spiritual friend, and they include that as the first before even the small scope beings. And other teachers have added how to abandon the self-cherishing mind and how to abandon all worldly concern in favor of spiritual concern. And that often is also included right at the beginning. So sometimes this list gets expanded, or any individual topic might be subdivided. But in general, that is the outline of the Lamrim, of the stages of the path. And that is the outline I'm going to try to follow. So those are the ideas, the big ideas that I'm hoping to pull out in different texts. And then whatever texts have to offer us, then we'll see where we can go from that, what different insights, what different philosophical ruminations we might have. So that's the plan. In each episode, if you like, of this series, what I hope to do is first have a discussion about the philosophical idea that is most predominant in that book that I want to talk about, and then maybe give an overview or a review of the book itself without any spoilers, and then talk about the ideas, the themes, how they made me feel, how I reacted to them, and try to bring some sort of dialogue around those ideas in that way. I might have to go into spoilers for some of the books. It'll depend on the book and the topic. But if there are spoilers, I will announce them before they happen. And I think that's it. That's the plan. So to talk about the different ideas, and then the book itself, and then how those 2 meet, and how the book can be a source of inspiration to meditate on different philosophical ideas, and how to then incorporate those into your everyday life. And so now it's time to announce the first book in the series. So this is the first book I'm going to look at. And the first one, I think it's fitting to choose the first novel that Stephen King ever wrote. And no, I don't mean Carrie. That was the first novel he published. But the first novel he actually wrote was The Long Walk. And he actually wrote it when he was still a freshman in college, which is mind-boggling. So The Long Walk was originally published under the name Richard Bachman. And I'll talk more about it in that video. But in short, the conceit of it, there is a competition every year called The Long Walk. And 100 young men are entered into it. And they have to just basically walk. And if you slow down to below 4 miles an hour, you get a ticket, and then or you get a warning rather. And after 3 warnings, you get a ticket, and that ticket is a gunshot to the head. And whoever lasts the longest gets a prize. And that's the whole conceit of this competition. And we follow a young man, I think a 16-year-old boy actually, who enters into this competition. You know, from King's side, He wrote this as a response to the Vietnam War and what he saw as this war industrial complex sending young men to die for no reason. And the way, the kind of blasé way the American government was treating its young men. And so this book from his side was a response to that. What I want to look at, what I think is useful to pay attention to, is how engaging in this competition limits the capacity we have to be complete human beings, how we have to strip away parts of ourselves in order to engage in this competition. And is this the most meaningful thing we can do with our life, regardless of how amazing the prize might be? Is it worth the cost? Even if we win, is it worth the cost? What happens to our humanity as a result of engaging in this activity? And so my thinking is to explore what it means to engage in this competition for these characters and how that limits their possibilities as human beings, and it dampens their potentiality. That video will be coming out in the first week of December. That's the goal. I hope to do one a month. We'll see if I can keep to that schedule. So either the first Monday or second Monday of December is the target goal for that video. And from there, at the end of that video, I'll announce the next one and we can go on this journey together. I'm really excited to begin this project, and I really hope some of you come along on the journey with me. For now, I don't think I have anything else to say. If you have any questions, please put them down in the comments, or if you have any suggestions, any ideas, specific titles that you're interested in me covering. I have a list of titles that I'm considering that I've lined up with different topics, but nothing is set in stone yet except for this first one. So any ideas you have or any suggestions, please put them down in the comments and we can be part of this process together, okay? For now, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.